Hi, I'm Davin Carata. Welcome to Crash Course Filipino History. Today we're going to be talking about the colonization of the Philippines, and specifically how the two different colonial periods of the Spanish and the Americans have shaped and changed the Philippines today. These impacts can be clearly seen in the name of the country itself. The Republic of the Philippines was named very shamelessly after its colonizer, King Philip II of Spain. This is something the Spanish did a lot with their colonies, but it's especially notable here because the name Philippines or Filipinas in Spanish is a word that's not strictly pronounceable in most Philippine languages, which lack the sound F. If that's not a good symbol for colonization, I don't know what is. However, the Philippines had a rich history before the Spanish ever came to name it. The islands were host to many diverse religions, including Islam, Hinduism, and animist beliefs, many languages, including Tagalog, Visaya, and Cebuano, and they were home to many different polities in various states and kingdoms of varying centralized power. The Philippines is divided into three distinct cultural regions: Luzon in the north, the Visayas in the middle, and Mindanao in the south. The Muslim kingdoms in the Mindanao, mainly the Sultanate of Sulu and the Sultanate of Maguindanao, were the most centralized states in the archipelago at the time. They employed a form of feudalism under their sultans. Governmental institutions in the north were much less organized, especially in the Visayas. They were based on the barangay, a community of 30 to 100 families, and was headed up by a hereditary chieftain or datu. Datus held supreme legislative, judiciary, and executive power over their barangays. Sometimes these barangays would federalize into larger communities or polities called a bayan. These bayans were headed up by a supreme datu or lakan. The most notable of these were in Luzon and included Tondo and Maynila. Although the archipelago had more than 100 languages, most of these indigenous Filipinos used a writing script called Baybayin. Baybayin was a flowing script, most likely of Indian origin. The Philippine Islands in pre-colonial times had decent access to domesticable animals. Pigs and goats came over before the Spaniards came, and there was even a native water buffalo called the carabao. In addition, there was a readily available workforce in these islands. It was centered mainly around agriculture, but also included skilled tradespeople and middle-class merchants. In 1519, Magellan sailed the Ocean Green to find a westward route to the Indies on behalf of the Spanish crown. By 16th of March, 1521, he arrived in the Philippine Islands. By the 31st, he had stuck a cross into the Cebuano soil and celebrated the first Catholic Mass in the archipelago. Magellan named these islands the Islas de San Lazaro, a name which didn't stick, but then again, neither did Magellan. Although the Spaniards successfully convinced many natives to convert to Catholicism and swear loyalty to Spain, the natives of Mactan and their leader Lapu-Lapu resisted. When Magellan and his men went over to compel Lapu-Lapu to do so, they fought, and in the Battle of Mactan, Magellan died. His men went back to Spain with a ship laden full of spices and treasure and made a huge profit, proving that the Philippines would be an economically viable colony for Spain. Magellan's voyage was important because it underscores the two motivations for Spanish colonization of the Philippines. First, religion, to convert heathens to the one true faith, Catholicism, and secondly, money, to trade with and wherever possible take resources from the Philippines and the surrounding areas and sell back in Spain at huge profits. Additionally, the figure of Lapu-Lapu is today regarded as a national hero for his defiance against the Spanish conquerors. Well, it turns out his work would be in vain anyway, as by 1565, Spanish explorer Manuel Lopez de Legazpi eventually settled the Visayas and established the Captaincy General of the Philippines. That name did stick, and so did the Spanish. In order to conquer the entire archipelago, the Spanish allied themselves with various barangays to conquer those who wouldn't join their empire willingly, the same strategy as they utilized in Mexico and in Peru. The disorganized, smaller states of the Visayas fell first, then the larger, more loosely federated states of the Luzon, and then Mindanao, those established Muslim kingdoms, fell the last. The Spanish quickly got to work on setting up extractive institutions in the Philippines. The Captain General of the Philippines was the king's representative in the islands, and he held supreme power over the army, the navy, the legislature, and the courts. These militaristic institutions were set up to stop the natives from rising up against the Spanish. The near-absolute authority of the Captain General over these islands is likened to be a semi-feudal form of government. The rest of the colonial political system exemplified a non-inclusive institution. For 250 years, the Philippines was administered from Mexico as part of the Viceroyalty of New Spain. After Mexican independence, the Philippines was directly administered from Spain. Filipinos never got a chance to have autonomy over their own government. The highest government offices could only be held by Spaniards. The best you could hope for as a Chinese or native mestizo was the gobernador dorcillo, a equivalent of a mayor, and literally translates to little governor. However, in order to reach this position, you'd have to be Spanish speaking, which was a right that was afforded to only a very few natives. In order to co-opt the previous institutions, the Spaniards took the old position of barangay chief and remade it into the cabeza de barangay, a municipal tax collector. Yeah. Okay. Hand in hand with this political system was a concept of social stratification known as the castas. It was a caste system that segmented Spanish and colonial society into a racial hierarchy. Different castes had different and unequal political, economic, and legal rights. Just as in Latin America, white Spaniards, peninsulares from Spain, and insulares, who were born in the colonies, controlled much of the wealth and political power. The native Filipinos were known as Indios, and they were cut off from all of these privileges. The term Filipino referred only to these insulares and peninsulares, although today it refers to everyone. These white castas were often granted encomiendas, which was the right to tax, excise tribute, and forced labor from a bunch of Indios in any given area, as well as haciendas, which was a plantation or estate that was often given to friars or monastic orders. The Spanish utilized a heavily extractive economic system. The natural resources of the Philippines were not as abundant as the gold, silver, and copper they found in Latin America, but they exploited whatever natural resources they could. The most exploited resource in the Philippines was its people. Not only the aforementioned encomiendas, but all Indios were subjected to a 40-day per year forced labor term known as a polo. These polos were usually utilized to build the great galleons that would facilitate the Manila-Acapulco galleon trade, which would bring the wealth of the Indies back home to Spain. The galleon trade brought great profits, but only to a few privileged Spaniards. The average Filipino Indio had to take time out of his subsistence farming to grow crops for the voyage, build the ships, make the textiles for the ship's sails. All this was very costly, and it arrested the population growth of Filipinos in the 1700s. Sociocultural effects were also clear. The Spanish stopped the use of Baybayin as a national script and used the Latin alphabet instead. Filipinos were made to adopt Spanish last names. Spanish cultural elements, including artwork, clothing, and holidays, replaced traditional ones. Spanish words became loanwords into Filipino vernaculars. But the most significant institution, and not usually for the better, was the Catholic Church. The Church held significant control over the lives of Filipinos. In the early days of colonization, they would go around to villages that didn't convert to Catholicism and burn them. They also forcibly resettled Indios to areas closer to those with the church. This was a process known as reducción. In the late colonial period, a group known as the Spanish Friars, white parish priests from monastic orders, came to control huge tracts of land, tax collection, manipulate the civil government, and even control the flow of information through press censorship. Spanish friars became so influential that by the late 1800s, they basically appointed the Captain General. These friars were seen as great hypocrites who took vows of poverty while extorting the local populace and amassing great material wealth. So severe was the power of the friars and so hated by the Filipino populace that they described the Philippines as a friarocracy. But education is the place where the non-inclusive institutions of Spain and the friars is most obvious. The Spanish were never dedicated to truly educating the Indios of the Philippine Islands. A organized and widespread public school system was never set up, although a few universities here and there were. A few educational institutions that did exist served mainly the privileged upper class. And even then, most public schools in the Philippines were very short on course material. They didn't teach much outside of Catholic theology, doctrine, and basic reading and writing to learn the Bible. And none of this instruction was in Spanish. They only taught in the local vernacular. The Spanish investigators reported that the Philippines public school system was inadequate. As such, in 1863, Queen Isabella II promulgated the royal decree, which decreed that every town in the Philippines shall have a school that instructed its students in Spanish. However, this plan more or less failed, as the friars still had complete control of the education system, all public schools, and even the universities. They withheld teaching in the Castellan language despite these orders from the crown to do so. Instead, they continued teaching at almost all levels in the native languages. Their reasoning was, a Philippines that was divided by ethno-linguistic lines would never unite against Spain and against the friars' own power. What'd you say? It's time for the mystery document? Okay, the rules are simple. Either I get the author of this document right, or Mr. Forsyth can take 10 marks off this assignment. They little by little lost their old traditions, the mementos of their past, gave up their writing, their songs, their poems, their laws, in order to learn by rote other doctrines which they did not understand, another morality, another aesthetics different than those inspired by their climate and their manner of thinking. Then they declined, degrading themselves in their own eyes. They began to admire and praise whatever was foreign and incomprehensible. Their spirit was dismayed, and it surrendered. I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that it was Philippine national hero Jose Rizal in his propaganda pamphlet, The Philippines 100 Years Hence. Is that right? Yes. It would be a lot more impressive if I didn't write the script. So those Spanish friars turned out to be right. Although the education system was very exclusive, there were some mestizo and indio sons of merchants who did manage to become educated in Spanish and eventually went over to Spain to be educated further in higher institutions. This burgeoning educated middle class was known as the Ilustrado, of which Jose Rizal was a leading member. The Ilustrado used pamphlets and novels to further their goal of modest social and economic reforms of the Spanish government in the Philippines. They included getting Philippine representation in the Spanish Cortes, lessening the tax burden on Filipinos, instituting racial equality between all the castes in the Philippines, bringing better Spanish language education to the Philippines, reforming the very corrupt civil service, and also separating church from state in the Philippines. But Spain decided not to listen to the moderate reformers, as history always tells us is a brilliant idea. In 1892, Jose Rizal was arrested by the Spanish colonial government because of the novels he had published. All of his works, his teachings, and even his image were banned in the Philippines afterwards. The Ilustrado and the reformists began to decline after his arrest, but a hardline group of revolutionaries would soon rise up in his place. Inspired by the Philippine nationalism of the Ilustrado, these revolutionaries were, however, willing to take it a step further, to use violence to attain the end of Philippine independence from Spain. The most notable of these revolutionary groups was the Katipunan, who had this flag. I know, it's unfortunate. And they were founded by Andres Bonifacio. The Katipunan grew in secret all across the Philippines, but by 1896 the Spanish Friars had discovered their plot. Believing Rizal to be aligned with the Katipunan, which he was not, they executed him. But this only served to exacerbate Filipino resistance against the Spaniards. The Katipunan won a series of victories against the Spanish, and thus a revolutionary government was proclaimed with Revolutionary General Emilio Aguinaldo as its president. Aguinaldo executed Bonifacio under dubious claims of war criminality and held a new constitutional convention in the city of Biak-na-Bato. The Republic proclaimed of Biak-na-Bato had a series of demands, all of which addressed the non-inclusive and extractive nature of the Spanish institutions at the time. 1. The expulsion of the friars from the Philippines and the returning of their lands to Filipinos. 2. Representation of the Philippines in the Spanish Cortes. 3. Freedom of the press and religious tolerance. 4. Equal treatment and pay for civil servants of all races and castes. 5. Abolition of the government's power to banish citizens. And 6. Legal equality for all Filipinos. Aguinaldo's statement showed his place as the violent advocate for the reforms of the Ilustrado and showed the Filipino people's desire to make the institutions that govern them more inclusive. After a series of stalemates, the Spanish made peace with Aguinaldo's Biak-na-Bato Republic. The terms of the peace agreement was that Aguinaldo and most other revolutionary leaders would be exiled to Hong Kong and given a bunch of money to get the hell out of the Philippines, and the Spanish would start working on those reforms as promised. However, they didn't exactly do so, and lots of revolutionary groups in the Philippines kept their arms at the ready because the Spanish weren't making any progress. The Philippine Revolution came into its next phase when the Spanish-American War broke out. The American Asiatic Fleet, led by Admiral Dewey, made quick work of the Spanish forces in the Battle of Manila Bay. Aguinaldo, believing himself to be allied with the Americans, came back from Hong Kong on an American ship to rouse up whatever revolutionaries were left in the Philippines and drive out the remainder of the Spanish army from the islands. This republic wasn't going to stay, however. With the Treaty of Paris that brought peace between the United States and the Spanish Empire, the United States was meant to obtain the Philippines as a territory. However, the First Republic informed the Americans of their disagreement to these terms, and the American Senate refused to ratify the treaty. However, fighting then broke out under dubious circumstances between the First Philippine Republic and the American Army in the Philippines, and then the Senate voted to ratify the treaty. The Philippines then became the de jure territory of the United States. The Philippine-American War was a quick and brutal conquest for the Americans. The United States, for a long period after the war, refused to even acknowledge it as a conflict between two sovereign states and labeled it as merely the Philippine insurgency. Brutal atrocities committed by the Americans based on racist attitudes were commonplace throughout this war. Most notoriously, American General Jacob H. Smith ordered his troops to kill Filipinos indiscriminately. Quote, "I want no prisoners. I wish you to kill and burn. The more, the better. It shall please me. I want all persons killed who are capable of bearing arms." When pressed for a limit, he replied, "The limit is 10 years. His orders led to the direct deaths of at least 2,500 or as high as 50,000 Filipinos. Reliable statistics put the number of Filipino military and civilian casualties for the entire war anywhere from 200,000 to 1 million. Mark Twain famously bemoaned the Philippine-American War as one where 30,000 killed 1 million, but by 1901, with the surrender of Aguinaldo, the United States had complete control over the islands and proclaimed them a U.S. territory. The Philippines would remain a territory of the United States until 1935, where they were proclaimed a Commonwealth, a protectorate of the United States, with much greater national autonomy. The Philippines would only gain independence in 1946. The interests of the United States in the Philippines were numerous. They were guided by President McKinley's proclamation of a benevolent assimilation of the Philippines and by Rudyard Kipling's poem, The White Man's Burden, which was created and inspired by this Philippine-American conflict and the American response to the Philippine occupation. These interests in the Philippines included economic interests in wanting to sell American goods to the Philippines, military interests in the Philippines' strategic location in the Pacific, some religious sentiments from Protestant missionaries wishing to convert the Catholic Filipinos, and mainly to institute a friendly and Americanized government in Asia. The most important of all of these interests was establishing American business and a dominant trade presence in the East. The Philippines was seen as the natural market for American goods in Asia. Indiana Senator Albert Beveridge claimed that the Pacific was our ocean, and America concurred. American goods were sold to the Philippines with no tariffs or duties, but Philippine raw materials coming into America were charged duties. American goods were sold to the Philippines without any tariffs or duties, while Philippine raw materials coming into the United States were charged some taxes, tariffs, and duties. This was an unequal economic system that was meant to extract wealth from the Philippines 3 times over. First, in selling the manufactured goods. Second, in buying cheap raw materials. And third, in charging duties on those raw materials coming into the United States. Not only extractive, this American economic system was non-inclusive, as the Filipinos had no representation in the United States Congress that passed these tariffs that would greatly impact Filipinos. Philippine infrastructure, most notably in hospitals and roads, was greatly improved with American goods and American businesses. This was an arrangement that was oddly enough beneficial for both colonizer and colonized. However, this created a huge economic dependence on the United States. Commonwealth President Manuel Quezon opposed these tariff arrangements because he believed this economic dependence on the United States would threaten the Philippines' hope at future political independence. When the Great Depression hit in 1935, American businesses lobbied Congress to add tariff provisions to the Tidings-McDuffie Act. This restricted Philippine exports to the United States in order to protect domestic American industry. However, it devastated the local economy of the Philippines, who now had a surplus of all these cash crops that were typically being sold to America and now had no more buyers. Quezon was right. The Philippine economy was at the mercy of American interests and would remain this way for a long time, even after independence. Modern Filipino scholars note how American colonial policies supported traditional elites and feudal social relationships that continue to form the basis of today's modern Filipino oligarchy. The second most important of these reasons was to remake the Philippines in America's image. Americans were hopeful that the Philippines could soon become the little brown brother of the United States. That under 50 years of close supervision, the Filipinos could learn to adopt Anglo-Saxon political and social practices. For this purpose, public education was very well funded under the United States. It focused not only on religion, but on secular subjects such as math, sciences, and laws, and also on American principles such as democracy and individual rights. Scarcely 3 years after the end of the war, the United States implemented the Pensionado program, which sent Filipinos with scholarships to study in the United States. learn skills there, and bring them back to the home country to better its administration, in hopes that the Philippines could soon become a self-sufficient and independent state, of course, an ally of America. The Americans were very keen to teach the Filipinos the English language. Literacy rates under the Americans went from the single digits when they took over to roughly 2/3 by the time the Commonwealth was proclaimed in 1935. The Americanization of the Philippines is demonstrated through its political system. For the first 7 years of being an American territory, the Filipinos were ruled only by American authorities, appointed by the president, and not by any Filipino elected leaders. The Americans passed laws which restricted Filipinos' freedoms to criticize the American government, fly the Filipino flag, or endorse Filipino nationalism publicly. However, they began to transition into a democratic system. This democratization very soon began to resemble the American system. The Filipinos had elections for a bicameral legislature in 1916 that very closely resembled the American system in both the style and the pageantry of the political election and the substance in the political procedure used in the House. The Filipinos used this newfound political consciousness to advocate for their own independence and lobbied the American Congress to pass the Philippine Independence Act, which provided a pathway to Philippine independence within 10 years. When the time came to write a new Filipino constitution for the Commonwealth, it was a near carbon copy of the American Constitution and was very quickly approved by American authorities. But American colonization wasn't all sunshine and roses. Filipino nationalists hold that the American administration of the Philippine territories led to a continuation of this colonial mentality, which led to an over-admiration of all things American and a devaluation of all things Filipino. Filipino historian Teodoro Agoncillo notes the social analysis brought about by the American occupation. While enjoying the blessings of America, the Filipinos suffered a partial loss of their heritage. The love of their language and culture has been replaced by the adoration of the American language and culture, and the traditional communal unity has been superimposed upon by the American individualist philosophy. He also notes how the conditioning of Filipinos to American luxury goods and standard of living has brought Filipinos to greater economic dependency on the United States and killed traditional domestic industries. And so we can look back at the long-term effects that both colonization periods have had on the Philippines. Spain's 333-year-long reign in the Philippines was very clearly oppressive and extractive. Spain's 333-year reign in the Philippines was very clearly oppressive and extractive. They took as much as they could from the Philippines while excluding them as much as possible from all the wealth and power that they obtained. The Spanish colonial legacy can be seen in small ways: adoption of Spanish last names and customs, such as the debut, and in larger ways.
Spain's largest and most successful impact in the Philippines is its Catholic religion. 81% of Filipinos today follow the Catholic faith, in no small part due to Spanish conversion.
Income inequality and the equivalent to a social caste system still exist in the Philippines. The Philippines' Gini inequality coefficient remains the highest in Asia. Inequality and lack of social and economic mobility in the Philippines has been regarded as a modern-day caste system. Income inequality and a social caste system are still present in the Philippines as remnants of the Spanish colonial past. The Gini inequality coefficient in the Philippines remains the highest in all of Asia. That income inequality, coupled with a lack of social and economic mobility, contributes to the sense of there being a modern-day social caste in the Philippines today. Colorism is still rampant today in the Philippines, borrowing from the Spanish castas. Lighter skin is perceived as more appealing and desirable in the Philippines, and there's a multi-million-dollar skin whitening industry that's very common in that part of the world. There are tangible results to this colorism as well. Lighter-skinned individuals are more likely to find and attain work in the entertainment industry, which promulgates this idea for a new generation. And it's worth mentioning that the non-inclusive political and economic system set up by the Spanish led not only to the Philippine Revolution, but also to communist rebellions in the Cold War and Muslim uprisings in Mindanao until the present day. The Spanish are also culturally significant. They gave the Philippines the Latin alphabet, Spanish loanwords, religious and cultural festivals, but what might be most important is what they did not leave the Philippines with: the Spanish language. As it was never taught in the Philippines, native languages are still the ones most commonly spoken in the Philippines today, with Spanish and Spanish-based Creoles falling behind almost all native languages and English. As for the American occupation, its results are much less subtle and have led to many great benefits for the Filipino people. For instance, the American importation of the English language, which is now the global language of business, has been an incredibly important asset for the Philippines. America also brought the Philippines their entire political system, and much of modern Filipino culture is influenced by American culture. It should also be considered that the Philippines co-opted less savory parts of the United States, such as partisan politics and corruption in the civil service. It's also very true that cultural erasure has been present in the Philippines as a result of the American colonization. The English language is used in many official, formal, and government communications, and in many cases is considered more high class than Filipino language. It can be argued the United States has created economic dependence within the Philippines. The Philippines today still imports much more than it exports from countries such as the United States. Perhaps Theodore Agoncillo was correct about the killing of domestic traditional industries. Indeed, today, 10 million people worldwide work as overseas Filipino workers who go to foreign lands in order to find economic opportunities because there's a dearth of them in the home country. The stilted trade system that the Americans set up did help to hinder the economic productivity of the Philippines. This is a topic that's very close to my family, as members of my family have been overseas Filipino workers in this exact way. The American colonization has led to materialism and a national inferiority complex to be present in the Philippines. There's an obsession in the Philippines today with foreign, especially American brand names. As such, the Philippines operates 3 of the world's 10 largest malls. Additionally, Philippine domestic products are considered to be of a lower quality than foreign imports. For instance, this box of Skyflakes produced in the Philippines brags that it is export quality, good enough for non-Filipinos. That's the story of the Philippines. It's colonization, revolution, colonization again, and eventual liberation. And the way I see it, the course of the Philippines is one that's shaped uniquely by its unique colonizers, for good and for evil. The Spanish, for instance, with their unabashedly extractive institutions, and the Americans, with their more deceptive and paternalistic methods, have in their own way shaped and changed the Philippines into the country that it is now. These colonialist legacies are not gone. They have deep roots, and they continue to impact Filipinos today as they will tomorrow. And although the Philippines stands as a free nation now, it's important that we remember that it wasn't always this way. For although colonialism is left in the past isn't dead. It's not even past. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week.